Everyone, Dr. Hall again. We're finishing out lecture 17, now talking about receptive language, so how it comes in and is perceived and understood by us. So this is a sensory function, right? So this is integrating sensory information that is coming in that we read, we see, especially in terms of sign language, or that we hear coming in through our ears. So this is going to be performed by Wernicke's area, technically pronounced Wernicke because he was German, but most Americans pronounce it Wernicke's. So that is this area here, which is mostly described as in the superior temporal gyrus as part of the temporal lobe, but I think you can appreciate that it's also pretty close to the parietal lobe, so sometimes there's a little controversy there. So let's think about what's going to happen now. So it is going to be Wernicke's area that understands and processes the language that's coming in. So for things that we hear, remember, that's going to cause our tympanic membrane to vibrate, which is going to cause the ossicles to vibrate, which is then going to cause those vibrations to be transmitted to the cochlea. And then different regions of the cochlea are going to vibrate, which causes the hair cells, the stereocilia on the hair cells to bend, and those are mechanoreceptors that then release glutamate, which activates the spiral ganglion cells whose axons, then come out and become part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which we can see then here, right? So the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then that's going to come up into the brainstem, and you might recall that for hearing, when we learned about that sense, there's lots of relay stations in the brainstem. So it's going to first have a synapse in the medulla, then in the pons, it's going to synapse in that superior olive, and that was the part that helped us with lateralization of knowing like where the sound was coming from. And then it's going to go up to the midbrain, and that's where we had those centers, that pretectal area, which is involved in auditory reflexes, right? In turning if you hear a loud noise. And then it's going to go up to the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, right? That triage center for sensory stimuli. And then it will go to the primary auditory cortex, which you can see is out here in the temporal lobe. So we have that primary auditory area in the temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex. And from there, then, if it is language that we are hearing, it's going to go to Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is going to allow us to understand and comprehend and kind of decode that language into meaning. What about when we see something? So whether you are reading something or whether you are watching someone do sign language, so here it's coming in through the eyes, so those light rays are coming in through your cornea and then through the lens, and then they get focused on the retina where you have those photoreceptor cells that are not technically neurons. They're special photoreceptor cells that release glutamate, which signals the bipolar cells, which signals the retinal ganglion cells, whose axons then become the optic nerve. Then that crosses at the optic chiasm, but individual axons may or may not cross, depending on which part of the retina they're from. If they're from the nasal part of the retina, they're going to cross, and if they're the temporal part of the retina, they're not. They're going to stay ipsilateral. And then we're going to go to through the optic tracts then after the chiasm, and end up in the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus and have a synapse there, and then send axons through optic radiations back to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. And so if it is language related visual information, then that's going to go to Wernicke's area for processing so that we can understand it. So if you have damage to Wernicke's area of the brain, you can get a language disorder. Aphasia is the word for a language disorder that is called Wernicke's aphasia. And this is often called a fluent aphasia. Fluent meaning you can talk with no problem talking. It's not halting at all. So this is the opposite of a Broca's aphasia. So what we find in individuals who have Wernicke's aphasia, they have no trouble speaking at all, but the words don't make sense. There's just no comprehension there. Sometimes they will speak using real words, but they're not in the right order, or they're not necessarily the correct words to describe what's happening. Or sometimes they will use made-up words, and to them it will seem like it's fine because they have this really impaired comprehension of words and language. Sometimes this speech is described as a word salad. It's just random words, like it's just pickle black forward yesterday. Right? It's just random words kind of all just jumbled together. And what's interesting in this condition is that because this is the part of our brain that's involved in making sense of that sensory information, sensory language information, they usually have trouble with comprehension. So in the video that's assigned, it shows you Byron, which is this gentleman we see here, who has Wernicke's aphasia. And the interviewer asks him some questions, and he doesn't completely understand her questions, but he's very adept at using body language and other cues in the environment, like if she looks a certain direction or she gestures a certain way, to kind of guess at what kind of things that she's asking. So it's a really fascinating video. I look forward to checking that out. The last thing I want to talk about is that the Broca's area and Wernicke's area are connected to each other through a band of white matter called the arcuate fasciculus. So in these diagrams here, the arcuate fasciculus is this band, these tracks of white matter. And you see there's two different images here. So what are we looking at? So in the one over here on the left, they're showing you the auditory area. So we're receiving verbal speech, right? We're hearing someone talk, and that comes into the primary auditory area. And then it goes into, this is Wernicke's area, which is the superior temporal gyrus, is Wernicke's area. And then that will send signals to the inferior frontal gyrus, which is Broca's area here. Right? So if I tell you to repeat after me and I say a word and you have to repeat it, this is what's going to happen. You're going to hear it, you're going to understand it, you're going to send signals to Broca's area, which are then going to send the appropriate signals to your primary motor cortex so that you can repeat the word out loud. So what's interesting is for repeating a word out loud, you don't necessarily need a lot of other brain functions to do it. Like you can just kind of use this. And if you're going to read out loud, so in this case, then we would be using V1. So we're using our primary visual cortex, right? Because we're getting this sensory language information through our eyeballs. And then that's going to there's this additional place called the angular gyrus, and then again to Wernicke's area here, and then that's going to go through the arcuate gyrus to Broca's area to come up with the motor plan so that you can speak the words out loud. So what's interesting about this is that when you are speaking, you are also listening to what you're saying. So that kind of gives you the ability to give a little feedback there and make sure that what you're saying is what you thought you were saying or hope you were saying. Yeah. So for receptive language, this is coming in verse. So this is sensory language. This is afferent, right? This is stuff that is coming into our central nervous system. Either we're reading it, we're hearing it, we're seeing it in some way. So Wernicke's area is going to process and interpret the language. So you can think of it as our sensory association area that is specific for language. And it is absolutely crucial for understanding language. Without it, we cannot understand language correctly. We went through the visual pathway. So our photoreceptors to our bipolar cells, retinal ganglion cells, optic nerve, optic tract, lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus, optic radiations, primary primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and then to Wernicke's area so we can understand it. And then the auditory pathway, right, coming in through the ear, tympanic membrane, ossicles, cochlea, hair cells, spiral ganglion cells, vestibulocochlear nerve, multiple stops in the brainstem, medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, and then out to the primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, and then to Wernicke's area. So if you have aphasia due to damage to Wernicke's area, you can speak fluently, no problem. You can make motor plans to say lots and lots of different things, but they might not make any sense because you just do not have that comprehension. And then lastly, Lastly, remember that Broca's and Wernicke's areas are connected by that arcuate fasciculus, that white matter band. So that allows you to repeat after me, that allows you to read out loud, and it also allows you to kind of monitor what you're saying and adjust accordingly. All right, that's it for lateralization and language.